Story 1. I have seen strange things working as an EMT in northeastern Colorado. Long, empty roads, forgotten towns, places where silence stretches for miles. My brother, a deputy, often let me ride along during the slow hours, just killing time between emergency calls. That night, it was close to 3 a.m., and we were about to wrap up our shift when we made one last drive through Amherst. Amherst is nothing more than a handful of houses, a church, a grain tower, and a small park. With only 50 people in town, it was the kind of place where you would not expect to see much activity at that hour. But as we rolled down the dirt road, something shifted in the darkness near the park, a flicker of movement, too faint to make out. My brother slowed the cruiser, and I reached for the spotlight. The beam swept across the playground, empty slides and old seesaw, before landing on a figure, a girl, sitting alone on the swing. She faced away from us, her back perfectly straight, hands resting limply on her lap. The dim glow of the spotlight cast long shadows across the dirt. She did not move, not even when the wind rustled the trees. Just a kid, maybe 13, staring at the ground in complete stillness. My brother and I exchanged a glance. Something about the way she sat there, unnaturally still, felt off. "Let's call her over," I murmured, uneasy. He nodded, reaching for the PA system, but when we looked back, she was gone. No movement, no sound, just an empty swing, swaying slightly. We scanned the park, the spotlight bouncing off the rusted jungle gym, the patchy grass, the low wooden fence enclosing the area. There was nowhere for her to go. The playground was completely open, no trees, no buildings to hide behind. She had been right there, right in front of us. My pulse pounded in my ears. Should we check the area? Maybe she... "Hell no," my brother muttered, already pulling away. He kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the wheel. I did not argue. For the next few miles, we drove in silence. I kept glancing at the side mirror, half expecting to see a shadow trailing us. The air inside the cruiser felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. My brother was not the type to spook easily, but his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Whatever we had just seen or thought we had seen, he did not want to talk about it. When we finally reached the station, I hesitated before getting out. "You really think she was..." "We are not talking about this," he said, cutting me off. His voice was low, firm. "Not here, not anywhere." I let it drop, but the unease followed me home, even after I showered and crawled into bed. Sleep refused to come. I kept picturing that swing, the way it had moved ever so slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe we had imagined it. Maybe she had run off when we were not looking. Maybe she was just a kid messing around. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I started digging into Amherst's history, checking old town records, online archives, anything that might give me some context. What I found made my stomach turn. A girl had gone missing there years ago, 13 years old, last seen at the park. Her case was never solved. I stared at the faded newspaper article, my hands trembling. The photo was grainy, but there was something eerily familiar about her. The shape of her face, the way her hair fell over her shoulders. It was her, the girl on the swing. I slammed my laptop shut and took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. My brother had been right. Some things are better left alone. Story 2. My uncle was a cop for years, and he had his fair share of strange calls. Some of them were gruesome, some tragic, and a few, like this one, just left him unsettled in a way he could never explain. There was an old woman who called the station almost every night. Her complaint: fairies or elves were breaking into her home and stealing her food. It had become routine. Dispatch would send a unit. An officer would check in, find nothing unusual, and reassure her that her home was safe. My uncle was assigned to her house at least 2 or 3 times a week. She lived alone in a quiet neighborhood, her small house crammed with decades of memories. Each visit was the same. She would meet them at the door, whispering about tiny creatures sneaking in while she slept. Some officers dismissed her claims entirely, chalking it up to old age and an overactive imagination. But my uncle, he always treated her with respect. Then came the night when everything changed. She met him at the door, eyes wide, gripping his sleeve with a trembling hand. "I have proof this time," she whispered. She led him inside, straight to the kitchen. My uncle stepped in and his breath caught in his throat. The floor was covered in a fine layer of powdered sugar, and within that white dust, hundreds of tiny footprints, too small for a child, too perfect to be a mistake. They trailed in and out from the pantry, around the table, and toward the back door. His partner walked in behind him, took one look, and immediately pulled out his camera. "What the hell?" someone muttered. More officers arrived, some out of curiosity, others because they had responded to this address before and could not believe what they were seeing. 10 cops, standing in silence, staring at a floor full of tracks that should not exist. The old woman stood off to the side, nodding as if she had expected this all along. "See? I told you they were real." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my uncle's partner crouched down, studying the delicate imprints in the sugar. "These aren't human," he said quietly. "But they aren't like any animal tracks I've ever seen either." No one knew what to do next. Could they file a report on fairy footprints? The silence stretched, and then something moved in the pantry, a soft rustling, followed by a faint scratching sound. Instantly, weapons were drawn, flashlights flicking on as officers turned toward the noise. My uncle moved first, stepping carefully toward the pantry door, gripping the handle. A deep breath, then he yanked it open. The light from his flashlight caught something small and gray scurrying behind a bag of flour. Another flash of movement, then another. A wave of relief washed over him as he let out a breathless chuckle. Baby possums, 7 of them, huddled together in the pantry's corner. Their tiny paws matched the prints in the sugar exactly. It turned out that a mother possum had been sneaking into the house, carrying her young in one by one, and leaving them to explore while she searched for food. Normally, baby possums cling to their mother's back, which is why the officers had never seen tracks like these before. They spent the next hour carefully gathering the tiny creatures, releasing them in a safer, more natural area outside of town. The old woman stood by, watching with a satisfied look, as if she had solved the mystery herself. "Guess I won't be getting any more visits from the fairies," she said with a small smile. My uncle never forgot that night, not because of the possums, but because for just a few minutes he had truly believed her, and for those few minutes he had no explanation at all. Story 3. Working the night shift at the station was usually uneventful. Paperwork, radio chatter, the occasional drunk call. That evening, I was at the desk, watching the clock creep toward the end of my shift when the fire alarm signal went off. The department used to offer alarm monitoring services years ago, and though most were disconnected, a handful of locations were still hardwired in. It was a pain to dismantle the old system, so we let it run. Our dispatcher had already punched in for the next shift, so she took the call while I grabbed my keys, ready to head out the door toward the fire department. But before I could leave, 911 rang. Same address I picked up. Silence. I strained to listen, hoping for a voice, anything, but the line was dead. Not static, not breathing, just empty air. My gut told me whoever called barely had the time to dial before passing out. I bolted out the back door, jumped into the nearest squad car, and radioed in the 911 call over Channel 3, the shared line between police and fire. Another unit pulled up just as I reached the house. No smoke, no flames, nothing. Then, from down the street, movement. An older woman pushing a wheelchair with an elderly lady inside. They slowed as they saw us. Confusion, then concern, spread across their faces. "That is our house," the woman said cautiously. "What is going on?" I quickly explained the fire alarm signal and the 911 call. The daughter furrowed her brow. "We do not have an alarm system," she said. "It was disconnected years ago during renovations, and we have been out for a walk. No one else lives there." That last part sent a chill through me. My partner and I exchanged glances before doing a slow walk around the house. It looked untouched, no forced entry, no windows open. Then we reached the back door, and the smell hit us immediately. Gas, thick and heavy in the cool evening air. Through the window, we could see the oven against the far wall. My partner stepped forward, turned off the gas main, and cracked open the doors to air the place out. A quick inspection revealed the source: a cracked gas line behind the oven. The daughter's eyes widened as she took a step back. I must have done that," she whispered. "I spilled my coffee earlier and moved the oven to clean up. I must have broken the line when I pushed it back in." We all stood there processing what could have happened. A few more hours, maybe less, and any spark, a stove, a light switch, could have ignited the house with them inside. 15 minutes later, the fire chief arrived. The moment he saw the elderly woman in the wheelchair, his expression changed. He walked over to her, knelt beside her chair, and took her hand. His voice broke. "It is good to see you again." Tears welled in his eyes as he turned to the daughter. "Your father, he was the fire chief here over 60 years ago, one of the best we ever had. And your husband, he was a firefighter too. We lost him a few years back, but he was one of us." The daughter wiped at her eyes, nodding. They both loved this town. The chief let out a breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I do not believe in ghosts," he said. "But someone called that alarm in. Someone called 911, and I think you know who." None of us had an answer. But as we stood in the quiet night, the gas fading into the breeze, I could not shake the feeling that someone who had spent a lifetime protecting others, had made one final call to save the people he loved. Story 4. There are stories that stay with you forever, the ones that defy logic and make you question everything you thought you knew. My father was a police officer for years, and he told me about one call that still haunts him. A man had snapped, turned violent in an instant. He shot his wife first. The neighbors heard the screams, the gunfire. By the time the police were dispatched, he was searching for his 5-year-old son. The boy, small and terrified, had managed to slip outside and hide behind the trash cans along the side of the house. But his father found him. He stood over the child and raised his gun. And then he fired. Not once, not twice. He emptied nearly an entire magazine at point-blank range. When my father and his team arrived, they expected the worst. The house was silent, except for the creak of the wind against the siding. They moved carefully, scanning the area for any signs of life. That was when they saw him, the boy. He was still crouched behind the trash cans, frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. Not a single wound on him. The side of the house, just inches from where he was hiding, was riddled with bullet holes. The ground around him was littered with spent shell casings. Yet somehow, impossibly, not one bullet had touched him. The officers wrapped him in a blanket, trying to comfort him, but he barely reacted. He just kept staring straight ahead, as if he were still seeing something they could not. It was not until later, when things had calmed down, that someone finally asked him what had happened. The boy's voice was quiet when he answered. "The angel was in front of me with a shield," he said simply. "He saved me." He pushed the gun away. My father never forgot that night. He had seen a lot in his time, acts of cruelty, of violence, of sheer blind luck. But this was something else entirely. There was no logical explanation. There was only the boy, unharmed, and the bullet-ridden house behind him. He never saw the child again after that night, but sometimes he wondered if the boy still remembered what had happened, wondered if he ever questioned why he survived, or if, deep down, he had always known the answer. Story 5. My father spent the last years of his firefighting career as the fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. The place was ancient, full of history that most people preferred to forget. Long before it shut down, it had housed the worst of the worst, the criminally insane, serial killers, rapists, cannibals, people society had locked away and left to rot. One day the state's safety inspectors came for a mandatory review. They needed to check every part of the facility, even the long-abandoned wings where no electricity remained. My father handed them the keys and a flashlight, warning them that the area was completely sealed off. No squatters, no staff, just empty hallways where echoes lingered far too long. It was not long before the inspectors started radioing back. "We keep hearing something," one of them said. "Talking. Footsteps." Impossible. Every section was isolated, with locked doors. No way in, no way out. They pushed forward, determined to finish, but the deeper they went, the worse it got. The whispers became more distinct. The footsteps no longer sounded distant. They were close, just around the corner, always just out of sight. Eventually, the inspectors had enough. They bolted before finishing their rounds, refusing to go back inside. My father was not easily shaken, so after they left, he decided to check the remaining alarm boxes himself. He moved carefully through the empty corridors, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dust-filled air. The silence was heavy, pressing against him like a weight. Then a feeling, a presence. He turned slowly, scanning the long, dark hallway. At first, there was nothing, just the peeling paint and the cracked tile floors. But then it shifted. A shadow. It took shape. A head, broad shoulders, a torso. But no legs, no feet. Just an empty void where its lower half should have been. Its face was worse. Two hollow pits where eyes should have been, staring straight at him, watching. His breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to move, to run. But he was frozen. Then the shadow twitched, a slow, jerky movement, like it was trying to step forward. That was all it took. My father turned and ran, his boots slamming against the floor as he raced toward the exit. He did not look back. He did not want to see if it was following. The hospital shut down years later, but whatever was in that building never left. Ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, even television crews came to document what many called the most haunted asylum in the country. My father was even interviewed for some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he had ever investigated. And my father, he never set foot inside again. Story 6. I have been on patrol for years, and while I have responded to my fair share of strange calls, nothing ever compared to this one. It was late, just past midnight, when dispatch sent me to a remote mountain home. The caller claimed that several people had been standing on her property, holding a baby above their heads and chanting. It sounded absurd. I even smirked when I heard the details over the radio. But orders were orders. It took 20 minutes to reach the house, winding up a narrow road where no one had any business walking this late at night. The area was dead silent. No cars, no movement, just the woods stretching endlessly on either side. When I finally reached the address, the uneasy feeling hit me immediately. The house was isolated, barely lit by 2 dim porch lights. Trees surrounded it on 3 sides, pressing in close. The driveway was gated, so I parked and walked the rest of the way. As I stepped onto the patio and knocked, something rustled to my left. A heavy sound. Close. I swung my flashlight, expecting to see someone lurking nearby. Nothing. Just empty space. I knocked again. From inside I heard voices. 1 male, 1 female. That eased my nerves a little. Maybe the caller was just paranoid. Maybe it was just her and her husband overreacting. The door opened, and I saw her face. Wide eyes, trembling hands. She was terrified. "Please come inside. Shut the door." I stepped in. The house felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing against the walls. She led me to the living room, where an old security monitor sat on a table, displaying a grainy black and white feed of the front porch, where I had just been standing. "I saw them," she whispered. "They were right there." I glanced at the monitor. Nothing. Just the empty patio. I started to ask her to explain, but stopped myself. "Where is the man inside?" I asked instead. "I heard him when I knocked." Her face went blank. "There is no man here. I live alone." The unease in my gut tightened. I knew I had heard a man's voice. My partner checked the house from top to bottom. Nothing. The woman handed me her phone. I took pictures. I scrolled through the blurry images, seeing nothing at first. But then, 2 figures, tall, dark silhouettes standing at the door. One was holding something. The next photo showed the object raised high. The last one, the object, whatever it was, had been placed at the base of the door. The figures just stood there, watching. I swallowed hard. The video feed had been empty, but the photos said otherwise. The audio on the monitor suddenly erupted. A deafening blast of sound, like wind, but deeper, unnatural. The woman flinched, pressing her hands over her ears. My partner and I stood frozen. The trees outside were still. There was no wind. I turned to her. "What is that?" she whispered. "It is them." My partner and I stepped back outside, scanning the yard with our flashlights. The rustling sound returned, moving just beyond the tree line. My partner shook his head. "I do not want to know." We finished our search and returned to the woman. She was already packing a bag. "I am staying in town tonight," she said, her voice shaking. "I am not staying here alone." We walked back to our patrol cars, the forest eerily silent around us. My partner muttered something under his breath, climbed into his car, and sped off. I laughed at first, until I stood there alone. The feeling crept in again, a heavy, watching presence just beyond the trees. I got into my car and left too, and I never took that road at night again. Story 7. I work in fire and EMS, and while this did not happen on my shift, a captain once told us a story that still unsettles me. It was late, the kind of night when nothing good happens. The first due engine company was dispatched to a residential fire alarm. We respond to these all the time, and most turn out to be nothing. Faulty alarms, burnt food, a system glitch. No one expected anything serious, but as they neared the neighborhood, an eerie orange glow flickered in the distance. Fire. When they arrived, they found a massive home, roughly 1,000 square feet, already engulfed. Heavy flames poured from the back of the house, reaching through the roof. The call was immediately upgraded to a working structure fire, and additional units were dispatched. The captain stayed outside, coordinating the response, directing crews, ensuring safety. He was in constant radio contact with the firefighters inside, who were battling the blaze room by room. Hours passed. The fire was nearly out. The structure was still standing, though parts of it were barely holding together. Then the captain noticed something, smoke curling from a second-story window. He radioed in. "Check the BC corner. Make sure the fire has not spread." Minutes later, the reply came. "There is no room there, sir." The captain frowned. He was staring at a window. A real, solid window attached to a real, solid room. He relayed detailed instructions, but the firefighters inside insisted there was no door, no entry, just a solid hallway where the room should be. That did not sit right. With permission from the incident commander, the captain entered the house. He climbed the staircase, walked to the exact spot, and saw for himself. No doorway, just an unbroken stretch of wall. But that window existed. He had seen it. He knew there was something behind that wall. So they breached it. Dust and drywall crumbled away as they stepped through. On the other side, untouched by fire or time, was a child's bedroom. A dresser, a desk, a perfectly made bed. The air inside felt thick, stagnant, as if no one had stepped foot in that room for years. There were no signs of smoke, no fire damage. It was like a forgotten piece of the past, sealed away and hidden. The homeowners arrived later, watching from a distance as the last embers were extinguished. The captain, still unsettled, approached them. "Did you know there was a walled-off bedroom upstairs?" The owners exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them muttered, "We do not talk about that room. They never explained. They never set foot inside, and no one ever got an answer as to why it had been sealed away." The captain said it was one of the strangest, eeriest things he had ever encountered. And that room should not have existed.